So I want to start by wishing everyone a happy new year. And by saying, right, when we began last year, 2020, there was a virus already out in China, probably by that point already in Europe, probably by that point already in the United States. And we had no idea that it was there or how devastating it would be. We start 2021 with vaccines being administered. And I just want to reiterate what I've said to you before. It's a remarkable feat of pure and medical science that we have moved so quickly into the realm where we can protect ourselves. And we're not there yet. As a matter of fact, things are in many respects quite bleak right now in terms of the pandemic. But unlike last year, where we were entering a dark tunnel and we didn't even know it, we are within sight of a better response to the pandemic at the moment. And so we have to be patient, but I think it's a hopeful start to the new year. Having said that, I also think there's a lot to be critical of in terms of the way the vaccines are being rolled out. And I will share a little bit of information about that with you. But before I do that, I want to talk with you about what I'd like to do with you today and in the weeks to come. And my plan is actually to start a new lecture series and to go back and forth between that lecture series and what's happening in the world a little bit with you. And so to explain for a moment, we have been fixated on American politics for a very long time together. And that's in part because we were in the throes of a national election. By the way, right, this Tuesday we'll finally know the full import of that election, or maybe not, but at least the votes will be taken and begin to be counted in Georgia and the two runoff races for the Senate there. And so obviously there will be things to return to. But I think it's time to start talking about some other stuff as well. And so what I'm proposing is that we discuss technology, and not from a technical point of view, but from a humanitarian, cultural, philosophical, and political perspective. And do so because, of course, for the better part of a year, we have been talking to each other in this way, right? From one computer or cell phone to another, and not in person. And there's a question: what is that doing to us? In a sense, it obviously diminishes our sense of closeness, both literally, but I suspect emotionally as well. But this is not just us. This is nearly ubiquitous at this point. Young children are going to school via computers or phones. People are going to work. Religious holidays are being celebrated, et cetera, et cetera. This is accelerating and spreading an ongoing transformation in human society and human social relations in, I want to say, forgive the loaded term, human nature. And so that's what I would like to speak with you about today and in coming weeks. I won't go exclusively on that topic because we have an old presidential administration about to leave. We have a new presidential administration coming in. I think it makes sense to take stock and to look ahead and to look at Joe Biden's administration and to try to see what he is revealing about perhaps the way in which he will govern from the people he's appointing. So I'll move back and forth, but I do want to spend several weeks speaking with you about the way in which technology is being employed in a pandemic and the way in which that is rapidly accelerating the adaptation of new technology to age-old human life and ceremony, relations, social and personal, familial, friendly, romantic, right? This is changing us, and so it's worthwhile trying to figure out how it is doing so and what we think about it. And if we are not entirely happy about the prospects of technologically mediated human change, what we can do about it. So that's the theme. This is a theme I've spoken with you about before. Some of you will recollect, I'm sure. And I don't believe I will be too redundant, but there may be covering some ground that we've covered together before, but I promise it'll be mainly new. Uh, Before that, we do need to keep track of what's happening with the virus. This is the most momentous event of not just this year, last year, but really in terms of its human impact. This is equivalent to a world war, and what we are seeing is, on the one hand, that the rate of transmission has come down somewhat, thankfully. What we see here is the post-Thanksgiving spike that many people predicted. And as the transmission that was caused by people traveling and gathering for Thanksgiving took hold, then we saw something of a contraction in the rate of transmission. The worry, of course, is that with Christmas, we may in fact see yet another and higher spike. And I just want to be clear about the magnitude of this. We are now to more than 20 million Americans having contracted the virus. We are seeing roughly 200,000 new cases a day. And you can do the math. That means we're going to be seeing 1 million or more new cases a week for at least, I assume, the next couple of months. And of course, the deaths were right about 350,000. If you do the deaths above average for 2020, it's about 380,000. And though not all of those deaths are from COVID, they are nevertheless attributable to what the pandemic is doing to our healthcare system. And so this is a humanitarian crisis of really unprecedented proportions. And of course, I think the most worrisome number here is 125,000 people in the hospital with COVID on the last day of last year. And that is really testing the capacity of our hospital system in many places in the country. Now, when we look at the other side of the equation, which is, of course, vaccination, what we see is that the vaccination is starting to take hold. And I'm especially pleased to see that it's North Dakota, South Dakota are getting more vaccination, more vaccines actually administered into their population. But please note, right, that the majority of the country has less than 0.5% of its population vaccinated. The places that are doing really well have 1.5% of the population vaccinated. And by way of comparison, right, this is a vaccine that has been available for about 10 days now. Israel is leading the world at the rate of immunization, and they're immunizing 1% of their population per day. And at that rate, they will probably pick up pace. We will hopefully and probably pick up pace too. They will be done vaccinating their population in March. And the rate that we're going in is simply too slow. And I shared with you last week that the effectiveness of the vaccine is only one variable. The rate at which the virus is spreading, the rate at which the vaccine is administered, are independent variables that determine how effective the vaccine will be in preventing deaths. And it turns out that the rate of viral spread and the rate of vaccine administration are more important than the effectiveness of the vaccine. And just to give you again a little bit of slightly updated concrete data on this, right? What we can see is that, right, we've had roughly 20 million doses allocated or allotted in the United States, but still less than 3 million actually administered. So around 10–15% of the virus that's being allotted, sent out to the states, is being actually put into people's arms. And the reason that this is so slow is absolutely predictable, right? And I want to be clear, right? We do not really have national coronavirus policy, right? We have substantial, important federal support for vaccine research. And we would not have the vaccines that we have right now were it not for that support. And we would not have the vaccines being allocated to the states were it not for Project Warp Speed. It's important, but it's only part of the puzzle. The states have seen their tax revenues crater with what's happened to the economy as a result of the pandemic. The states don't have any capacity to do deficit spending, and they do not have a lot of latitude for sudden, large, unanticipated expensive items in their budgets, right? And not only that, the states don't have the capacity, they don't have the technical wherewithal or expertise to, on their own, effectively administer this. I just returned to this map for a second. It's comical and sad at the same time. You probably saw in West Virginia a couple days ago, they administered 40-odd doses of the Regeneron plasma therapy to people who thought they were receiving the vaccine, right? The people who were administering it thought they were administering the vaccine. And when you put Regeneron in somebody's arm, it doesn't work, right? And so it's a very expensive, very rare, very efficacious therapy for people who have the virus that was misused and so ruined, right? And that's just an illustration. The West Virginia National Guard does not have the wherewithal, the expertise, the capacity to adequately administer this vaccine. That's no knock on the National Guard. That's just an indication of the fact that they are not trained or equipped to do this. We need federal support. We need federal policy. We need federal leadership, national leadership on the virus. We need it in terms of mask policy, social distancing, business closing. We need it in terms of contact tracing and isolation policy, the stuff that is being done in many countries in the world that are much more effective at combating the vaccine. And now we need federal leadership on, I'm sorry, I said combating the vaccine, obviously combating the virus. Now we need federal leadership on the vaccine as well. And the good news here is though the Trump administration has primarily adopted this policy, that the national government will take responsibility for supplying the states, but the states have to take responsibility for administering the supply and developing the policy and enforcing it. I believe the next administration will take a different approach. We will have more national leadership, and it will take time, but hopefully, eventually, we will do better than this. By the way, if we continue at this pace, we will not fully administer these doses before they expire. A lot of them are being stored in non-ultra cool refrigerators, non-ultra cold refrigerators, and the result is that these first doses will expire, will go bad, or will lose their efficacy by the end of January. We won't have administered all of them by the end of January if we can't accelerate the process. All right. That's really all I wanted to say about this, just to bring you up to date and to opine for a moment about why we're not doing well. Let me transition now into the topic for the first lecture, on new technology, social media, digital technology, and what it's doing to us, how we're using it, and how our use of it changes us. And I've shared with you a couple of images of self-representation. I've also shared with you image from the protest after George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis. And part of my effort here is to say, look, we reflect upon ourselves. And as we reflect upon ourselves, we shape ourselves. And if you have a mirror, right, your capacity to reflect upon yourself is transformed. If, depending upon what medium you're using, you are able to create a representation of yourself, your self-conception may be changed, right? And whether we're talking about Velasquez or Rockwell, we have been doing this for a long time. But now, of course, we are doing it with selfies on our cameras and Facebook and constantly using filters. We will get into this, right? But the media that we use to view ourselves, to reflect upon ourselves, to present ourselves to others are formative of how we think of ourselves, how we present ourselves, how we communicate with each other, and as the Floyd protest makes clear, also how we organize ourselves. Our capacity for collective action depends in part on the density of our networks, the ease with which we communicate, our capacity to get a message out, to coordinate, to be surveilled, or to escape surveillance. All of that matters for the kinds of political action, collective action, social action we are capable of organizing and participating in. Now, let me pull back for a couple minutes and start thinking about how technology shapes human nature or the human condition. And to do that, I'm ultimately going to speak with you about Paul Klee and his painting, The New Angel, Angelus Novus, and also what Walter Benjamin, the German Jewish philosopher, thought about this image, or the way he appropriated this image. But let me start with the basics. And so I'm going to start with the plasticity of the human mind and some fairly recent cognitive science. The discovery over the last 20 years, which I believe won Eric Kandel the Nobel Prize, that neuroplasticity, the ability of the human brain, and not just the human brain. He was studying sea slugs when he originally made these discoveries. The ability of brains to continue to learn structurally all the way through life. And so to be clear, the received view in neuroscience for much of the last 70 years, so overturning a previous view, was that essentially cognitive development basically ends around age 20. That the formation of new neural networks, of new synaptic connections is concentrated early in life, that the structures there then don't really change. They basically just deteriorate over time. Maybe we can tweak the way we use those structures, but the structures are in place. And the new learning that has occurred over the last 20, 30 years is that that's just not true. That actually humans and many other animals are capable of building new neural structure when they are mature. And by the way, that's good news, right? That means that we learn all through life. And in a sense, that's reporting something that we are already aware of. But the better news still is that we're not just, if we're learning something new at 70 or 80 or 90, using the old structure, we're actually potentially building new structure. Learning can generate new synaptic connections all the way to the end of life. And this is related to the more general idea of neuroplasticity, that the human mind is carried, it's housed in the brain, and the brain can change throughout life and is changed by the culture of the society that you live in, by the particular things that you do in your life. So to take a simple, straightforward example, if you live in a pre-literate culture, or if you live in a literate society, a society with a written language in which people learn to read and write, and if you learn to read and write, your brain will develop in different ways than if you don't learn to read and write. And there are places in the frontal cortex that get much denser neural interconnectivity as a result of acquiring a language that is written and read and acquiring the neural capacity to actually read and write. So by learning, we change the structure of our brain. Similarly, if you are a cab driver in London and you have to pass that test, right? London is one of the most complex cities in the world in terms of its size and its streets and its neighborhoods. And you have to be able to find the most efficient place from point A to point B in order to get your London cabbie license. Actually, different areas in the brain, areas associated with spatial navigation and orientation, develop much greater density in a London cab driver than in the rest of us. And those are just illustrations of the way in which what we learn, how we think, actually changes how our brains develop and where they develop their strongest capacity or capability. By the way, I suspect it is the case that London cabbies today do not memorize the map of the city of London, and that they don't rely on their knowledge of all of those interconnected alleys and streets and roads and roundabouts, that instead they use the GPS on their phone, right? And that the result is not only that they're doing something different, but that their brains have a different structure. And I just want to think about that for a second, right? Knowledge that used to be on a page, a map, right? That we then studied and then committed to memory, we are now relating to in a very different way. We are containing it in a device and consulting that device, not in advance in order to memorize the route, but while we're in the process of navigating. And that is just the tip of the iceberg of the way in which this technology is changing us. Now, I want to give you, I think, a fun example for a moment of how some of this works. And so this is a diagram of the complexity of the brain in terms of the horizontal axis and the mean group size, or what you could say is the complexity of the society for monkeys, apes, and humans, right? And as you can see, there's a very straightforward and strong correlation between brain size and group size, and hence social complexity. And if you think about it for a moment, one of the most complex things we do is to learn the rules and patterns and norms of our social group, right? I've given you this example, I think, before, right? But for instance, how long a conversational pause is necessary in order to be able to interject your comment without it being considered a rude interruption on the part of the person you're speaking with, right? That is something that in fact varies culture by culture. Italians do it very quickly, Americans somewhat more slowly, Egyptians still more slowly, right? And so there's an awful lot to learn if you're in a relatively large, complex group with a complex status hierarchy, et cetera, when deference is due, what gender norms there are, what social cues you should be picking up. And so it tends to be the case that you can only occupy a relatively large, complex society if you have the brain power to do it. And it turns out that human beings actually dedicate an awful lot of their cognitive capacity to social cognition, right? And yet there's a question, right? I've just shown you, right, that the brain size varies. We have the big brains, right? That's in part why we are the dominant species on the planet, for better and worse, right? Why, in fact, we now have the capacity to render the planet vulnerable, to potentially destroy the planet. How do we get to have such big brains, right? Well, one of the things that's interesting here is the brain is actually the most energy, has the highest rate of energy consumption of any organ in the body. It uses the most blood, the most oxygen, hence the most nutrients, the most calories. And this is a little bit speculative. Obviously, we don't engage in time travel, but the scientific evidence, the anthropological evidence is pretty clear, which is to say it's not until we started cooking food that we, as a species, could absorb rapidly enough the calories necessary to support a larger brain. Now, it's obviously not the case that we learned to cook so we could get bigger brains, but once we were, in fact, able to ingest more nutrients, we then probably started a self-reinforcing cycle, which is to say that when mutations did occur that led to early Homo sapiens having larger brains, we were in fact able to sustain ourselves, as opposed to a large brain being a disadvantage because it took more nutrition than we could get. It became an advantage, and so we selected for larger brain size at some point in early humanoid evolution, and that allowed us to then form complex societies, and we're on our way to being human, right? And so I hope, I'm not losing the forest for the trees. How we think depends in part on a technology. Can we cook food? And how we think also in part determines what kind of creatures we are. Now, you may have heard Emerson's famous quip that we are tools of our tools. This is, did I get it wrong? I actually think it's Thoreau's famous quip. I'm sorry, I'll have to look that up at some point and get back to you on that. But the idea that we are tools of our tools is a 19th century kind of transcendentalist critique of technological civilization, right? Which is to say, for really probably the first time in human civilization, as we approach the second half of the 19th century, Emerson, Thoreau, others are beginning to glimpse a stage of human civilization in which our technology is no longer controlled by our ethical or religious or political or cultural values, in which we adapt technology without first considering what it's going to do to us as individuals or as a society, politically, culturally, etc. And I want to be clear. I think this is a genuine concern, but I also think it's an exaggeration. And this is sometimes referred to as technological determinism or technological autonomy. And there's a quite influential book out right now, What Technology Wants, right? The idea is that we don't use our technology to do what we want. Our technology uses us to do what it wants. And we'll get into that as we get further into these lectures. But that is the thesis of technological determinism. And I want to be clear, that has not been true for most of human history. For most of human history, we have adapted or not adapted technology depending upon our values, our economy, our society. There's the famous example that the ancient Greeks probably invented a version of the steam engine and they didn't need it. So they didn't do anything with it. It was a toy, right? And obviously in the 19th century, when we invent the steam engine and then later the internal combustion engine, we employ it systematically and it alters our sense of space and time, our ability to connect across long distances, etc. And so, right, technology is not autonomous. It hasn't been for most of human history. But if the pace of technological change is very fast, if the rate of adoption of new technology is constantly accelerating, then perhaps we lose the time, the distance, the critical perspective required to actually exercise some judgment and some control over what we want to do with our technology, or more importantly, what we don't want our technology to do to us. And so what I would say, as opposed to technological determinism, is that the use we make of our technology is strongly conditioned by the structural potential of that technology. And so to be clear, right, the idea here is that the medium, right, contains different possibilities, for instance, for communicating a message. When the medium is the printed word, it depends upon the reader actually unpacking the meaning. There is a moment of mediation in which the individual reading the text has to decipher it and make sense of it and make meaning out of it, right? It's an active process. And that actually means that when we started to have widely disseminated printed words, we got the essay and the novel, right? Forms of use of the printed word that relied on the way in which the person who receives the printed word interacts with the message, right? And so the medium and the message are inseparable. As we moved to broadcast journalism with radio and television, and to be clear, broadcast refers to the idea that you're reaching a mass, a broad audience. Similarly, the fact that a few people were broadcasting to tens of millions of people affected the message that they transmitted. They had to find ways of speaking that were accessible, that applied to or appealed to things that were common in the audience addressed. And as we moved from broadcasting to narrowcasting with the advent of digital media and then cable television, you move from 3 or 4 stations to 200 or 300 stations. And so your audience is now a narrow segment, and you want them to be really loyal, that changes what you're going to say. The message is influenced by the medium. And similarly, as we move then into social media, in which it's no longer one station broadcasting to a whole bunch of people, but individuals broadcasting to each other. Anyone can put what they want to on social media. That influences the message, right? It's a peer-to-peer kind of messaging. All of a sudden, what we see on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram is much more like what we would see from our friends or our family or our neighbors, right? And so the medium and the message are inextricably connected with each other. That's a very good example of the way in which the structure of the technology conditions its use, but doesn't necessarily determine it. And I want to now really focus in on intellectual technology, and especially communication technology. And so let me start with a little illustration here, right? I could give you a quiz, right? Which of these things is intellectual technology? I think this thing is called a fidget widget. I'm not positive. If it's not, that seems like what it should be called. You may have seen these things. They were quite trendy a few years ago. You just put them between your forefinger and your thumb, and you can spin them really fast, right? They don't really do anything other than give you an outlet for your nervous energy. You may recognize this as the oldest surviving mechanical clock, right? And this is intellectual technology, right? This is something that helps us think, or that assists us perhaps in thinking in ways that we had not been capable of thinking until we got this technology, right? And so prior to the invention of the clock, we told time imprecisely. It was morning, it was noon, it was afternoon, it was evening, right? And that was judged by where the sun is in the sky, or how long shadows are, or our internal rhythms. And when we got the clock, all of a sudden we had a way of measuring time much more precisely, and hence measuring whether somebody was late for a meeting, how long it took to do a task, how efficiently we were working, right? And slowly but surely, the idea of the clock suggested metaphors for other ways of thinking, right? And so this is an example of an intellectual technology, something that we use to do something we had been doing in our minds, with our brains, that then allows us to do it differently, more precisely, or perhaps just liberates space in the attic for something else, right? We don't need to memorize maps anymore because we have GPS. Maybe that allows us to think other thoughts, or to use the limited capacity that the brain has for other purposes. But having said all that, intellectual technology, especially communication technology, is extremely important to human social evolution, to changes in the human condition. We see this, another good example is with the map, right? Until the technology and the intelligence and the breakthroughs in cartography and actually measuring physical distances required to produce precise maps, we often relied on folklore, on mythology, on associations. We had no precise sense of distance, and much of the world outside of our immediate knowledge, that part of the world we were directly acquainted with, remained scary, right? And not just did this shrink our worlds and increase our fear of the unknown, it also gave rise to superstition, right? To a sense of perhaps the world being enchanted with forces that we did not understand. And when we developed the map, all of a sudden our relationship to the world is changed by our capacity to move through a bigger world with precision. And again, that suggests new metaphors, new ideas, new ways of thinking, in addition to allowing us to connect to each other across larger spaces, to navigate a bigger world, to begin to integrate economies, etc. So intellectual technology, technology of communication is extremely important to change in human society. Now, the thing that I think, right, is worrying, I think it is Thoreau when he says we're becoming tools of our tools, is the vast, rapid, accelerating, I don't need rapid twice there, sorry, pace of technological transformation. And that's already occurring in the 19th century. But boy, you want to talk about accelerated technological change. Try bringing together two revolutions at the same time, a revolution in computational technology and a revolution in digital communication. So to be clear, and I know I've said this to you before, right, this little thing, and you can see I've already got one message in the time we've been talking, my little phone has greater computational power than the original IBM supercomputer that took up an entire airplane hangar, right? This little thing, which weighs a few ounces, is smarter than a so-called supercomputer that took up tens of thousands of square feet, right? And how did that happen? Well, it happened because of something that's called Moore's Law, which is about the rate of change in, we now refer to them as microprocessors. When Moore was, he's a computer scientist, it's not really a law, it was a prediction, but his prediction was originally talked about in terms of transistors, right? We don't use transistors anymore. But in terms of the number of integrated circuits that could be included in a single computational device, and as you can see in the 1970s, it was thousands. This is not a linear scale. Please note the top of this chart is 50 billion. Right, and so from 1970 we moved from around 1,000 to 2018, approaching 50 billion integrated circuits in a computational device, and this is because the circuitry, right, especially the microprocessors, have become smaller and smaller and faster, and this is accelerating the evolution of computational power in ways that are really hard to fathom, right? Our computers are now genuinely learning machines. We are living in an age of artificial intelligence. That means that the computers can process so quickly, engage in pattern recognition so fast, that they can begin to learn things that we don't program them to do, that they themselves discover by studying all the stuff we do, right? And so the fantasy of 2001: A Space Odyssey of HAL is in certain respects a reality, not in 2001, but in 2020, 2021, right? And so we have lived through the era of the revolution in computational power, and that has coincided with, and in certain respects been enabled by, the fact that we've also lived through the revolution in digital communication. And of course, the most important thing here, and you will remember back to the age of the dial-up modem, when you plugged your computer in through your phone line, right? And then nobody could use the phone or else it cut you off, right? And that high-pitched squealing sound that you heard as your computer was communicating with another computer over a phone line seems so primitive today, right? Because we now are in the age of cellular communication, in which radio waves carry communication from our devices to towers, then to satellites, then to other towers, then to other phones, so fast that it seems essentially instantaneous over thousands of miles. If it's transcontinental, there might be a little bit of a lag, right? But the fact that we are on a globe that is covered now by the footprint of satellites that enable our devices to communicate to each other over vast distances in almost no time has also completely transformed our technological horizon. And so again, if Thoreau were to look at 21st century America as opposed to 19th century America, he probably couldn't even comprehend what we are doing right now, right? And it is this convergence of computational and digital revolutions that have produced this unprecedented acceleration of technological transformation in the sphere of intellectual and communication technology. And if you remember back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, I don't believe that we are tools of our tools. I believe that for most of human history, we have in fact used our evaluative world views, whether they're religious or cultural or moral or political, to shape the way we use our technology. But that to do that requires a slow pace of technological change such that your values can keep up with your technology, such that you can change your values or adapt them or extend them as you see the new possibilities opened by technology. And we are living in an era where our technological change is so rapid that it's very difficult to do that. And yet, precisely for that reason, it's become all the more imperative that we do figure out how to do this. I was going to mention the Internet of Things. I'll just be very brief in talking about this. You're probably familiar with the idea that increasingly, if you buy a new microwave, if you buy a new a new refrigerator, a new washer or dryer or car, they are connected via cellular technology to centralized computer hubs. And by the way, how often and what time of the night you open your refrigerator, how long you tend to cook things in the microwave for, what presets you use, where you drive. Not only is all of that being captured, assuming your devices are connected to the internet, and mined to determine how to sell you the next thing, it's also being sold by the people who make your car or your washer and dryer so that online merchants can figure out what restaurant to tell you to go to or what detergent to tell you to buy, right? And so we are surrendering information about ourselves to those who want to use that information to manipulate us. That's something I think we should be critically reflecting on, certainly be aware of, certainly recognize as a social and political issue. To do that, we need to step back and ask, do we like what our technology is doing to us? Now, let me get to Paul Klee and Walter Benjamin. And Walter Benjamin, and I'll say his name the proper way, it's spelled like Benjamin, looked at this painting. And he saw something, I don't know if it's there or not, I tend not to see it, but he saw an angel, that's how Klee entitled the work, the new angel, Angelus Novus, right? Being blown backwards, right? And so as opposed to using those wings to fly, this angel is caught in a storm, is the way Benjamin put it. And that storm is, as Benjamin puts it, blowing out of paradise. So this angel is being blown out of paradise, has lost control, cannot get back to where it wants to be, and it's seeing at its feet the train of destruction that the storm is creating, right? And this, for Benjamin, was a metaphor for modern history. Walter Benjamin, a German Jew who ultimately died in a concentration camp, was seeing the rise of fascism, what radio and cinema technology were doing to his society, and he was scared. Right. And he was scared that we had lost control of our technology, that we were not in charge of our history, and that the result would be a catastrophe. And in many respects, he was exactly right about mid-20th century European civilization. Now, let me go back to the central idea of human nature and two different ways of thinking about the malleability, to come back to plasticity, right? If our brains can change, then we can change, right? And so to say that there is such a thing as human nature, perhaps the defining attribute of human nature is structured plasticity. That is to say, we are limited in how we can change, but we are changeable. And so understanding the relationship between the structure and the potential change is essential to understanding what makes us us. And I want to talk about two different ways in which we can change. One of them is self-interpretation. That is to say, the conceptions we develop of our important identities and how those lead us to act in certain ways. Let me give a concrete example. I'm a man, right? That's an identity that's assigned to me, but that I also choose to reflect upon and embrace or modify in certain ways. How do I define my masculinity? Does it include an idea of virility? Does it include an idea of economic responsibility? Do I believe that I have to be dominant in certain contexts with regards to other people in order to be adequately masculine, right? If over time I come to think that the way in which I've been socialized to think about masculinity is in fact problematic, maybe even toxic, right, to other people, that the way it leads me to treat them leads me to disrespect them, then I may revise my understanding of an aspect of my identity. I may even decide I shouldn't think of myself as masculine or a man anymore, but I might not go that far. I might just choose to adapt a different understanding of what it means to be a man. And as I do that, I will begin to behave and act and relate to others differently because I have changed my interpretation of myself, right? And I want to point out, so this is one way in which we are plastic, right? We relate to ourselves, to each other, to the world, not through simple drives, but through conceptions of the objects of desire and aspiration or hate or fear, right? And so we can change those conceptions. And as we do, we can change the principles that govern our behavior and action. I hope that's clear because I want to now spend a moment contrasting self-interpretation in which we have a certain kind of agency, right? We don't make this stuff up all at once. We inherit a whole bunch of concepts, but we have some capacity to reflect on them, to perhaps become critical of them, then to revise and change them. We don't do that again as individuals necessarily. We do that as a culture, as a society, as perhaps members of an interconnected world society. But we are able to exercise some agency in the process of interpreting ourselves. As opposed to that, there's another idea, which is self-modification. Now, let me return to an example I'm going to use a lot in this class, and that's the idea that we are increasingly reliant on handheld computers, call them cell phones if you want, for more and more activities. And I know many of you have grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and that in other circumstances you get to spend time with them. And I imagine you notice that they are often quite distracted by their phones. And then there's a term in contemporary psychology, fractured attention, that they're trying to pay attention to you, but they're also trying to pay attention to their screen. And that the screen, in a sense, is demanding that they not be fully present in the moment, right? And by the way, let's be clear about this, right? That the people who design the apps, the applications that our phones run, they employ psychologists who understand the brain very well and understand addictive behavior very well, understand dopamine, the pleasure neurotransmitter that is at the root of addiction, and the way in which they can create their apps to trigger dopamine production in a way that will make them addictive, right? Now, if what I've just said is correct, if these devices that we're all walking around with in our pockets are engineered to be addictive, if over time that works, if the result is that changes our capacity to pay attention, fragments our attention. Have we decided to do that? Have we decided I want to be the kind of person who has fragmented attention? Or have ourselves been modified by our technology? I hope you see the essential difference between self-interpretation and self-modification. There's room for a certain kind of agency with self-interpretation. We are being acted upon and, in fact, actively manipulated when the process is instead self-modification. And I think what Walter Benjamin is worried about mid-20th century European history, what leads him to talk about the angel of history as a tragic figure who can no longer use its wings, but is being simply moved by forces outside of its control, is this sense that the pace of change and the nature of change in intellectual and communication technology, beginning as early as the middle of 20th century, but certainly taking hold at the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century, is so fast, is so powerful, is so open to manipulation that we begin to lose control of ourselves, of our history, of our social relations. And so that is the central question of these lectures. Is there a way that we might begin to reassert collectively, individually, in families, in small settings and large groups, some control over the way in which our technology is changing us? Let me conclude today by, I've already shown you this, but this is one thing that's driving this technological change, the vast increase in computational power. The other big structural change that is driving this is the change in connectivity, especially cellular connectivity. This graph shows you in the developed world, in the late 1990s, around 10% of the population had internet access. Today, it's up to around 80%. If we look at the world globally, it was a minuscule portion of the population at the beginning of this century, right? 2%. And now it's up to 50%. If we look at the developing world, 0%. Now up to 41%. And as we can see, right, it plays out in terms of population. This is a stunning change in access to technology and connectivity that has occurred in our lifetimes in a very short period of time, historically speaking. And it is what we are all reckoning with today. All right, so I will stop there, and I hope I will have some time for questions, and I hope you will have some questions. Let me see, there are a couple comments in the chat, and then while I look at that, Suzanne, why don't you start us off? And after that, I'm seeing John with his hand raised as well. And it's Suzanne and John in the chat bar as well. Go ahead, Suzanne. Oh, and the question is, wait one moment, I'm sorry, I have to unmute everyone.
No, you don't.
Oh, that's true. You guys can also hold your space bars down. But Suzanne, let me see if you can talk now.
Yes, I have a fundamental question about the ability of Israel to finish vaccinating its people by March. What does that mean about everybody else in the world?
Okay. And
excuse me, Suzanne, could you put your head up a little more so we can understand you better, please?
well, I could understand her, and she asked, what does that mean about everybody else in the world? Is that correct, Suzanne?
Isn't that a problem?
Particularly the Palestinians.
Yeah, so Bob went exactly where I was going to go, and we could say Palestinians, we could say Arabs, we could say non-Jewish population of Israel, and clearly the dissemination of the vaccine is very uneven, with the Jewish population getting it very quickly, with many Palestinians, Arabs not trusting the Israeli healthcare infrastructure, not trusting the science, and so not taking the vaccine. And that's, I believe, something that may be starting to change, but I'm not fully up to speed on this, so I've got to be careful. But what I would say is two things. First of all, yes, in every society, we need 70, 75%. I think we're not entirely clear yet of the population to take the vaccine, to be vaccinated, for the vaccine to be effective for them, for the society to bring the rate of transmission, and then of course the rate of hospitalization, the rate of fatality down. Now, I'm not sure if I said this at the beginning. I think I didn't. But one of the interesting things that's coming out in most of the world, the proportion of the population that's over 70 years old is about 7.5% of the population. If you vaccinate that portion of the population, you can bring fatalities down by 70, 75%, right? And so there's an efficient way to do this. By the way, it looks like one dose of the vaccine is reasonably protective. So the approach that Canada and Britain are taking, in which they give one dose to as many people as possible, the US right now is in a sense only vaccinating half as many people as it could, because it's taking the approach that we're going to keep 2 vaccines for everyone. So there's lots of stuff to do here. But coming back to Israel and to Suzanne's question, well, we live in ways that I've just tried to show you, a globally integrated society, right? And so one of the problems that Israel will have is if it gets up to 75% vaccinated, but none of its neighbors do, none of the societies that it has commercial relationships with, will it continue to introduce new vectors of transmission? And will that cause the herd immunity to be less effective? I'm putting those as questions because we don't know the answer to it. But what's clear is that the United States, on the one hand, is a laggard, right? We're just really slow relative to the developed world in implementing effective antiviral policy. Hopefully we will get there this year. We did not do very well last year. It's why we lead the world in per capita fatality. But even if we get effective, can we really manage this without also facilitating everyone in the world ultimately having access to the vaccine. And I think, you know, if you're just being a humanitarian, obviously we have a duty to get this to everywhere in the world. But if you're also being self-interested, it may very well that self-interest will lead us to do this as well. All right, John, go ahead.
Changing the subject back to the beginning of your lecture, this morning's Wall Street Journal, in its review section, applies that idea of brain development to self-help for seniors. The article's called "You're Never Too Old to Become a Beginner. Learning a New Thing actually develops your brain, neurological people say." The best example is toddlers and the way they learn to walk between maybe age 1 and 2 by trial and error and falling down all the time. And the best thing they recommend for us is learning to juggle.
Interesting.
I know how to do that.
You may see, I'm trying to Google a book and I'm not getting there. So I will have to share this with you next time. But there's a very good book that I'm drawing on in what I've been saying to you. And I haven't actually read the book, but I heard I went to a talk by the author a while ago. Yes, you know, let's stay with walking for a moment. You know, actually, as you age, the rate of the communication in your body slows down. By the way, you also shrink. And so you put those two things together, and you've learned to walk based on being a certain size and having a certain degree of speed in nervous communication within your body. Those things change. If you work on balancing, if you work on strength, if you work on walking, you can update your internal communication systems. Of course, you don't really think 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot, right? That's not the way we walk. Something like juggling, you at first you think throw, 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 but then pretty soon it becomes automatic, right? So learning to juggle, learning to dance, learning to paint, trying to learn a new language, learning to play chess, learning about a topic that you don't know anything about, right? I'm just illustrating. There are a bunch of different things you can be doing to maintain neuroplasticity or the youngness of your mind, right? The youthfulness of your mind. And so, yes, and so I do think it's actually something, if I get the time and energy, I might actually dedicate a lecture or two to at some point. I am interested in this topic, and I think it's fascinating. But I think it's just wonderful news, right? That we keep learning, not just, you know, the mind, but the brain keeps building new structure as long as you are willing to stretch. Good, thank you, John. I'll look out for that article. All right, who else would like to ask or say something? Flossie, I can see you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
David, what do I do when I'm composing a text? Maybe it's an email, maybe I'm writing something, and suddenly my computer is telling me what I should be doing. And I can't say, get off the USOB. There's no way I can tell the computer to leave me alone. And suddenly, artificial intelligence is acting on my intelligence. And it isn't that I feel helpless, I feel angry. There may come a time, not for me, I'm pretty old, when all of us will feel helpless to fight back. That's the thing.
Because it already is doing it, yes.
Well, now if I feel like an idiot, I confess that I'm computer illiterate. Now, I haven't accepted the title fully, but I know that the techies around here think that I'm kind of crazy because I do crazy things.
So Flossie, what floor do you live on?
Any suggestions?
Yeah, I'm asking you what floor you live on.
What? Oh, I have a Mac.
No,
No,
I was trying to see if you live high enough to throw your computer out the window. But obviously that's a joke, right? You know, and this is the old can't live without problem. I believe.
Has this happened to you, David?
What's that? Oh yeah,
Has it
absolutely,
happened to you?
absolutely. Yeah, and so there must be some way to turn it off. I haven't bothered, but I will also say, and this goes into things that I will be lecturing about in the future. I, for the most part, don't use that autocomplete feature, right? And in part because I want to think for myself, but in part because I'm pretty sure that Google is trying to perfect its technology and using me as a guinea pig to do it. I don't like that either, right? But
there are, David, there are ways, but they've made it hard to find.
Yeah, so, and I hate to say it,
Yes.
but you could probably Google it, right? You know,
Google, yes.
yes, turn the weapon against the weapon, right? Anyway, so yes, and on the other hand, I think you're absolutely right, Flossie, to worry that what will happen is that our use of language will become standardized and lazy if we allow our computers to keep completing our thoughts for ourselves. And there's this concept in this literature, the cyborg, right? The person who is part human or part living creature and part computational device. And frankly, without integrating technology into ourselves, yes, we are well on our way to becoming cyborgs, right? And the more we let our computational devices think for us or nudge us, the worse it becomes. And I'll then immediately say one more thing here. And some of my friends accuse me of being a techno-conservative. I guess it might be the only way in which I'm a conservative. I used to use Google Music. Google Music got eliminated and became YouTube Music. I use YouTube Music now, and it inadvertently the other day, I hit something that I thought was one of my playlists, but it turned out to be a playlist YouTube was creating for me based on the kind of music I like listening to. It was great. And there's part of me that hates saying that, but I have to admit it played music that I really liked that I hadn't heard before. And so I think we also have to be careful in differentiating what is core to our human autonomy. I chose enough of my own music that my phone or computer or YouTube or wherever it is was able to learn about me and predict what I like. And then it introduced me to new music that actually I really like. I'm not sure that that's a meaningful loss of autonomy, as opposed to maybe a gain in autonomy. And so there's some things we can do assisted by our technology that are actually beneficial to us. I do have to end things now. I've got another lecture I give in 15 minutes. And I need to catch my breath and stretch my legs for a couple minutes. I hope you guys enjoyed kind of moving away from politics for a little while, or at least moving to a different quadrant of it. Please continue to be safe and smart and strong. I tried to say last week, and I still believe this, we don't know how prevalent the mutated virus is in our environs right now, and we don't know whether it's more dangerous, or if so, how much more dangerous it is, but it's appropriate to be cautious, especially now. I hope that you guys will be getting the vaccine at some point in the not too distant future, and that it will be protective. But until we do, we all have to be careful. Take care. See everybody next week. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Take care.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.